And here's maybe another way for us, for bishop or ward leaders, to kind of consider the quality of their being is, to what degree are you focused on survival versus purpose? And what I would find is that leaders who are more focused on just surviving, just getting through it, just making sure things run with as little problems as possible, that's one strategy for leadership. But it's not a very mature or sophisticated strategy for leadership. When we study the very best leaders are driven with a purpose. And that purpose is generally about creating value for the people that we serve, the stakeholders that are involved. And so, to what degree are we just simply, when we think about our ward council meetings, are we just focused on making sure that, all of the gears are turning? Or are we focused on something bigger than that? And that's a way to kind of gauge our being and how we're showing up as a leader.
We're back for another Leading Saints episode, and I'm excited to welcome back a recurring guest. That is Ryan Gottfredson, an author, a professor of leadership, and every time I connect with Ryan, it's just such good conversations. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do, and maybe I talk too much in these, I don't know, but these are principles worth considering. He has written so many phenomenal books, which we've highlighted on Leading Saints before. He's out with a new book called Becoming Better, and he really gets into the science of sanctification, how we not just do better, but how we become better, which this is at the core of the atonement. This is at the core of our theology, why we go to church, why we go to the temple, this reaching for exaltation. Ryan does a phenomenal job of putting it in book form and making it really digestible for the common man, us everyday lay leaders trying to do our best of becoming better. And there's so much application here as we're working with people who are really struggling in life, who need healing. How can we really show up for those people and guide them to healing, or guide them to the healer? And so, phenomenal discussion. You're going to love it. Now, pay attention near the end. We talk about bringing on if there's anybody out there who listens to this and wants to maybe step up into a place of vulnerability and talk about your own personal journey, and maybe if you have a passion for becoming better, Ryan's going to do we'll figure out the technicalities, live streams or other episodes where you can see this in real life, the application level of how somebody is applying these principles and actually becoming better leaders because of some of these, removing some of these, getting some of these mental blocks out of the way. So anyways, let's get into it. This is a great episode with Ryan Gottfredson, the author of Becoming Better. Now, Ryan, it's always great having you back here on the Leading Saints podcast. And I just got to say up front, before anybody emails me asking for a link to that beautiful painting behind you, you are in the hotel room. So you have no idea who the artist is or why it's up there, but it really brings out your eyes. I'll say that.
I know, right? I think I'm kind of matching. I've got, this is beautiful. So yeah, I'm in Biloxi, Mississippi in my hotel room, and this is what I have to go with. So we're stuck with it.
Nice. And you're a recurring guest on Leading Saints. I always appreciate our conversations. And you like to geek out about leadership stuff like me. And so we get another opportunity to do that because you've written another book. I mean, you just always got another book in you.
Well, this is the third book. And official launch date is June 25th. But spoiler alert, it's actually already available on Amazon. So people can pick it up. But nice. I'm just super excited about this new book. And if anybody has kind of followed me and our conversations, hopefully one of the things that you've observed is some of my thinking on leadership just over time has deepened. And each of the books that I've written has gone deeper and deeper into leadership. But I also hope at the same time more applicable. And that's been one of the challenges. How do we take some really deep leadership concepts and bring them to life for everyday leaders? And that's, I think, sets us up for us having the conversation that we do.
Yeah, for sure. Now, maybe give us a summary of just this journey you've been on with these 3 books. Because it wasn't like you had a master plan of it being 3 books or 5 books or 10 books or whatever. They've kind of led one into the other. Is that right?
Yeah, they have. Well, I don't feel like I'm going about doing this to write a book just because I want to write a book. I feel like in a way, honestly, I kind of feel like I've been called to write books. It's part of my mission, and I would never tell anybody. I mean, you have experience being an author.
Yeah.
I would never tell anybody to be an author unless they feel called to be an author,
Yeah.
because it is not easy. You spend way more money on a book than you ever make from book sales, unless you're part of the top 1%. And so it's not an easy journey. But I feel like with each of my books, I've had an idea that I just have to get out into the world. And so my first book, Success Mindsets, I just felt like I needed to get this idea of mindsets out into the world, because when we start to investigate our mindsets, it provides us an opportunity to transform ourselves at our most foundational level. And then, as I kind of dove into the notion of mindsets, I came to learn that when we focus on developing our mindsets, it actually is a unique form of development that most people aren't familiar with, which is called vertical development, as opposed to horizontal, which is all about gaining knowledge and skills. Whereas vertical is about elevating our internal operating system. So my second book was about that, elevating our internal operating system, vertically developing. And then as I've been promoting these ideas, I kind of go around to different groups. I'd say, I can help you vertically develop your leaders. And their ears kind of perk up, but then they're like, well, what's that mean? And so I kind of had to come up with a way to help people quickly figure out why vertical development is so powerful and why it's so important. And so my new book, Becoming Better, is all about helping people to recognize that we have two sides of ourselves. We've got a doing side, which is our talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we've got a being side, which is the quality of our internal operating system. So my new book is all about helping people learn what their being side is, helping them to evaluate their altitude along their being side, and then elevate along their being side. And what I've learned is that most of us are doing side development, and that could be incrementally helpful. But if we do being side development, that's transformational. And so
Yeah.
that's ultimately what I want this book to do, is help people to transformationally elevate themselves so that they can have a greater positive impact in their world.
I love it. And the thing I love about your books, and I guess this is the case with a lot of like self-help or nonfiction books, is you can't help but include so many gospel principles in there, because the truth is truth. I mean, was it your second book called Vertical Development? I'm trying to remember.
The Elevated Leader is the second
The
book.
elevator, that's right. But I mean, so much of our theology there is why we go to the temple, why we engage in the gospel, why we make covenants. It's not about us just doing a doing gospel, but it's about us becoming in the gospel and becoming more like our Father in heaven, right? So the fact that you're sort of doing another deep dive into that doing versus being concept is awesome, because this is where, I mean, where the rubber hits the road, when that person comes in to the bishop's office or is struggling, or you're figuring out how to teach that lesson or give that talk in sacrament meeting. It's so easy to default to that doing framing, when in reality we want to push people to the being framing, because that's where the temple pushes us, that's where the gospel pushes us, and that's where redemption is, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's my personal belief, is that the gospel really is about helping us to become like Jesus Christ. And we are just, because of it's our life's experience, our education systems, our athletic programs, our organizational development efforts focus so much on doing. A lot of times that's where we default to when we want to help people develop. Um, honestly, I remember when I was a doctoral student in Indiana, I was assigned to home teach a woman who had a lot of significant issues, and a lot like welfare issues, things like that. And all of my advice, I just look back and I kick myself, because all of my advice was like, doing stuff. Here's what you need
Yeah.
to do. Let me help you do it. Like, and some of that advice included, you got to read your scriptures every day. You got to go to church every week. You got to, and I'm not saying that that's wrong or that's bad, but what I didn't realize at the time was ultimately what's holding her back is not her like not reading her scriptures or not going to church. It's she had a lot of trauma in her past that caused her body to respond in self-protective ways,
Hmm.
and that and she had some self-protective fears, self-protective insecurities that prevented her from kind of getting herself out of her own circumstances. And what I've learned is that you can't go to, let's just say, extreme example, a homeless person and say, I know what you need to do to get out of your circumstances. You could tell them what to do. They're never going to do it. What you've got to do is, I want to help you to think differently than how you've ever thought before. And it's only once you start thinking differently that you will then be able to get yourself out of these circumstances. And we could kind of use that metaphor for any aspect of our life.
Yeah.
If we want to elevate at a foundational level, we've got to change our thinking. We've got to change our beliefs. We've got to change our values. And what research says is that most adults aren't super willing to do that. But that's what it takes for us to become more like Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And it makes me think of this, I think loosely fits your research and your book and what you're trying to articulate is I sometimes wince when I hear people frame the gospel into a mechanism that leads to happiness, where I think it's more effective to frame it in a way of a mechanism that leads to strength, right? So no matter how hard life gets, or you're actually a different person who can show up with more strength because of the gospel, not because you've dialed in all the doings and all the gospel principles, and you're just happy for some reason. And of course, we have those moments where we just feel that euphoria of happiness because of gospel related things. But I think on this mortal journey, it's more effective to frame it in a way of like, well, we do these things so we can become stronger and face life's challenges rather than avoid life's challenges and just be happy.
Yeah, I like your words, strength and stronger. Let me put forward another one. I'm not saying it's any better or any worse, but it's a different perspective, which is, I think that the church, and really the church is a vehicle for the gospel. And I think the gospel is ultimately about healing. So I think in addition to strength and stronger, it's also about healing. And I think that those are intertwined, because the more healed we become, the more strong, the more sturdy we also become. And I think that that's ultimately why Christ did what he did for us, is to help us to heal our minds, our bodies, and our hearts, so we could show up as a greater light in the world around us.
Yeah, no, it's powerful. That's perfect, because and that healing is really tricky. And as I interview like even a therapist about this dynamic, one close therapist I love and appreciate, is a good friend of mine, Steve Shields, talks about this concept of like the best things leaders can do to offer healing to other people is to do your own healing, to do your own work, right? And whether that's get into the therapist office or there's so many different ways to do it. But a few months ago, I'm an Elders Quorum president right now, so I was invited to this area family services Q&A type thing, and I show up, and there's ward council leaders from various stakes in Utah County, and we're all crammed into a chapel, and there's one therapist there from the local family services office. And she did a presentation. She started taking questions, and generally speaking, the presentation was good. The questions were great, but I'm just sitting there thinking, like, here we are under the impression that us sitting in this room and exchanging information and absorbing data, that it actually is helping us. When in reality, the best thing for these people to do is to sit with your own trauma, to sit with your own brokenness, and figure out where you could get healing. And I get that's a little tricky, but there's so many ways and pathways to do that. And the person you become out of that, right? And that's really this journey of leading saints. Like, if I've exceeded or upgraded my leadership skills and dynamics, is simply because I've been forced into these conversations, not forced, but I've sat in these conversations and really had to contemplate my own being. And a result of that is I've become a different person. I'm a different creature in Christ, and naturally I show up differently as a leader. Not because I got the 5, golden principles down or anything, but I'm just a different being. And again, I still have a long way to go, but it's that really is the key of leadership development, in my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And so I hope it gets us listeners to ask a few questions. One of those questions is, do I need healing?
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, Kurt, if you would have asked me that question 4 years ago, I would have said, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But what
Yeah.
I've come to learn for my own self, as well as the leaders that I work with in organizations and the coaching that I do, is every single one of us has room for healing.
Yeah.
And so the first question is, do you need healing? And I'm suggesting, yes, all of us need healing. So then the second question becomes, do you know how to identify the places where you need healing?
Mm.
And while I think some of us will recognize we need healing, I think that most of us will have a really hard time figuring out where we need healing.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the trickiest parts about this. And maybe I'm going to put you on the spot here, Kurt. Is one of the
Oh
things that
boy.
we discussed via email is we talked about maybe having a guest come on and we record a future session where
Yeah.
we have a volunteer and I walk them through a coaching process to help them to uncover some of these things. Because one of the things I've learned is if we could see somebody walk through it or see a system that allows us to systematically identify these places where we need healing, it opens the door for us to do that. So if anybody wants to do that, wants to be our guinea pig, then great, we'll do it. If not, then no harm, no foul, I don't think.
Well, I think there'll be several that would jump at that opportunity, and so we're going to do a variety of follow up, interactions like this, but with maybe some real life examples. So if there are people out there that want to step in and get some awesome coaching from Ryan and see that research and it happen right before their eyes in their own experience, yeah, we'll definitely create a way in the show notes to reach out and do that. So that'd
Great.
be awesome. And one thing I was going to mention just with this concept of like where I need healing, like this is, I think, especially in a Latter-day Saint context, and I'm sure it's elsewhere in other Christian or religious contexts where, man, I mean, we know we need a redeemer. We know we need a healer, but I mean, I feel fine, Ryan. Like I'm good, like, and I did this fun activity. I think I've mentioned it on Leading Saints before, maybe in a newsletter with my elders quorum. We meet in the culture hall and I had them basically see the whole culture hall as a spectrogram where one wall, was 0 as far as like, I asked them the question is how's life going for you? Or how are you doing in life? Right. And one wall of the room was like, terrible, there's a crisis, I can barely stand it. And the other wall was like, never been better type of thing. And I just has said, stand somewhere where you kind of feel like life is. And of course, there's this bell curve around about, 7 out of 10, right? And this is the I'm fine group or the I'm good club, right? And I'm the president of this club, right? Because if someone asks me like, where do you need healing? I'm like, well, actually, I'm good. No, I'm good. And to me, that can be almost the most dangerous place to be because, I don't know, I feel good. And to me, a lot of it goes back to stigma, where I think I struggle in life in so many ways that aren't stigmatized, right? I'm not behind the scenes, uh, strung out on pornography, or I'm not, doing meth, on the weekends, with nobody knowing, or I'm not embezzling funds, or all these different things that have a heavy stigma with it. That when it's discovered, it's like, oh, you obviously need healing. But there's these other areas where I'm able to cope in a maybe uh, more socially acceptable way, whether that's scrolling social media, whether it's getting a claim for my good works on Leading Saints or whatever it is, right? So anyways, I feel like this is a really powerful question to sit with for leaders to sit with, like, where do I need healing? I feel fine, but if you don't need healing, why would you ever need a healer?
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's ways for us to evaluate kind of where we stand on that continuum. One of the ways that I've found helpful to think about is, what is our width of our window of tolerance? Have you heard this term before, Kurt? Window of
No.
tolerance? Okay. So I'm actually surprised more people haven't heard of this term, because it's a fairly common term in the psychological space. And the idea of our window of tolerance is very much connected to our body's nervous system. So when we have our nervous system, our nervous system has a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. And when we want these to be activated both simultaneously to a moderate degree, and when they're both activated to a moderate degree, we are kind of feel calm, we feel cool, we feel collected, right? And when we're in this space, the psychological space, when pressure and stress come upon us or a challenge comes upon us, we're able to, oh yeah, I can navigate this in a really healthy way. But the more stress, the more pressure that we start to experience, the more we get thrown to the edges of our window of tolerance. Our nervous system starts to activate out of balance in a certain way, either towards being more hyperactive or hypoactive, where we tend to kind of shut down, for example, as the hypoactive. And the more, like, for example, when we start to get more hangry or tired, right? Don't you sense that we have a reduced capacity to take on stress and challenges, right?
Yeah.
Because we're moving towards the outside of our window of tolerance. And the more that we move towards the outside of our window of tolerance, the more we lose cognitive and emotional control. And there's even times where we get thrown outside of our window of tolerance, where we actually lose complete control over our cognitions and our emotions, right? These are the when where we see people flip out, right? That's its indication that they have exceeded their cognitive or their window of tolerance. So when we understand our window of tolerance, one of the things that we can also look at is, what is the width of our window of tolerance? How much does it take for us to be triggered and to be sent outside of our window of tolerance? And the reality is we can stack people up in a room from being a really narrow window of tolerance to being a really wide window of tolerance. And that window, kind of the width of our window of tolerance, is a really good indicator of the health of our body's nervous system. And here's the reality. Our nervous system is largely what dictates the degree to which we live like Jesus Christ. And when we need healing, it is generally about healing our body's nervous system to help us to become more regulated. Because when when we have a low window of tolerance, we are more reactive. When we have a wide window of tolerance, we're willing to sit in places of discomfort without losing our cognitive and emotional control. And when we think about the kind of the wisest, the kindest, the most Christ-like people, they are the people with these really wide windows of tolerance. The people who have the more narrow windows of tolerance, we just don't trust them to be people that we can go to for advice, for direction, for light, if you will.
Yeah.
So I think this window of tolerance concept is one concept that we could step into to kind of gauge our health, if you will.
Yeah. My mind also goes to, just the, more religious context of like sinning, right? We're often in one of those extremes when we sin, right? Where it's like, there's so much pressure. I'm not comfortable. I need to cope some way. And, that's when we get angry or do things that are out of character, or we just need to numb out, right? So we may rely on some coping mechanisms that way. Is that a fair model to use as well with like just sin?
No, spot on. When you think about any sort of kind of addiction or any sort of behavior, like, I would say that most, drug related, sex related activities that are kind of against our values as a church or our morals as a church, when we engage in those behaviors, that is more, to your point, a coping mechanism for our nervous system. And so we do it not because we lack some inherent knowledge or skills, but because it's when we do those things, it's actually an indication that our body's nervous system needs healing. Our body isn't able to function in the way that we would like it to without some form of substance activity, something along those lines, right? So people who oftentimes, one of the things I've learned, if, premarital sex is something that we're not a fan of as a church, well, why do people engage in premarital sex? Well, oftentimes it's because they come from a place where they feel unloved and unwanted. And when they're in a position where they can receive love and wanting, their body craves it. They want it. And that's a way to feed. And that's just an indication that, look, we need some healing because I'm not feeling like I'm inherently loved or wanted or of worth.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious, when you've used the concept of nervous system, like, automatically, obviously, when I think nervous system, I think of that's a physical experience or something happening with the brain and in connection with the body. And so it sometimes feels a step or two away from that spiritual experience. But I mean, this is obviously a holistic way to frame it, but it's not necessarily that you need a physical healing or a physical solution to this, but it's good to I guess frame it that you're having a physical response to whatever it is. I don't know if I'm articulating that well.
Well, yeah. Well, let me break it down into this way. So, one of the things that we've learned from a neuroscience perspective is we have three networks within our brain that are responsible for how we process our world. And these three brain networks are called the salience network, the default mode network, and the central executive network. So the salience network is our home of our emotions. That's when we get signals sent into our brain. That's where these signals are interpreted, where there's meaning assigned to these signals. Then, based upon the meaning assigned to these signals, then our salience network will either activate our default mode network, which is our home of non-conscious processing, or it will activate our central executive network, which is home of our conscious processing. And one of the things that we've learned is that, I'll just say it from this perspective, the more trauma that we've experienced in our lives, the more these three brain networks work out of balance. So in a healthy mind, these three brain networks work in a healthy or work well together. And when they work well together, we're able to interpret safe things as being safe and dangerous things as being dangerous. The more out of balance these brain networks are, the more we interpret safe things as being dangerous and dangerous things, like, for example, drugs, as being safe. And so ultimately, and this is a part of our nervous system, these three brain networks. So when we talk about healing, oftentimes in order to become more like Christ, we literally need to change and heal our neurology, how these three brain networks work together so that we could see safe things as being safe and dangerous things as being dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, and my mind just go to just the story after story, in the literal life of Christ as he was inviting people to come into him and to follow him. Like there was these types of shifts, right? It wasn't always necessarily a physical healing, with someone who was lame or had leprosy or things like that. But I think of like Matthew or Peter, where it's like, wow, this person's like changing me, right? He's reorienting my paradigm and my mind in a way that, is putting these things in the right categories of safety and danger, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, I'd say just in general, when you think about Christ's disciples, many of them were just kind of average people, right?
Yeah.
And how their body was wired, I assume, was wired for safety, comfort, and belonging. That's how most of us are wired. Is for safety, comfort, and belonging. So they're kind of operating in what I would call survival mode, right? They're fishermen. They're out there. Why are they out there fishing? Well, because they're trying to survive, right? And Christ comes along and invites them to think higher. And in the process of doing so, they have to shift their mindsets from being a fisher of fish to being a fisher of men. And this is an expanded perspective where we're no longer in survival mode. We're in value creation mode. We're in purpose mode. And literally, if we could do brain scans on individuals, we would see a shift. As people make this shift from being in survival mode to being in value creation mode, we would see a shift in how the brain literally functions. And we would see overall a healthier brain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's powerful. Love it. And it's really applicable, right? I mean, not that we're neuroscientists or, as church leaders, but when someone comes to a problem or they're struggling, like it's so, because going back to the window of tolerance, I'm just thinking of that bishop is living. He's sort of found this sweet spot in his window of tolerance where life is going pretty well for him, and just do the things, and you can be in the same window of tolerance where the other person is. There's so much more going on behind the scenes that you can't just compare. It's kind of like comparing apples to oranges, right? It just doesn't fit. And so then you're just saying, well, let's find, how do we get you to that window of tolerance? And that may be therapy or talking this through your more meetings or whatever it is. But hopefully that the gospel is prodding them to that place.
Well, yeah. Well, I would say, of course, our audience is church leaders, and we've all been a part and served under and with a variety of different types of church leaders.
Yeah.
And I'm going to paint kind of some polar edges here. So I've had some bishops that I've been a member of their ward and served on ward councils where the bishops have been very dictatorial. It's a very top-down oriented approach. Maybe that was our mission president, right? Is kind of these hardliners. And what I've just learned is that oftentimes these dictatorial leaders have a higher need for control. Well,
Yeah.
why do they have a higher need for control? Well, ultimately, it's because they have some fears and insecurities related to feeling out of control or not feeling like they're not going to be respected in some form or fashion. So there's some fears and insecurities that ultimately drive more authoritative, dictatorial leadership. But then there's other leaders that we've worked with who are much more empowering. They're not this top-down leader. It's a much more a collective approach. And what we would find, again, and what this indicates is kind of a spectrum of health of the leader. And so this comes back to your point, is oftentimes the best thing that we can do for the people that we lead is to heal ourselves. So what we find is that people have more leaders who have more fears and more insecurities operate as less healthy leaders than leaders who have healed from their fears and their insecurities. So generally, if there is, I'm going to just call it limited or limiting leadership, ultimately that's always going to be rooted in some sort of fear or insecurity or hurt that has gone on. And that, if we can uncover that, that's a place where we need healing.
Yeah. And my mind goes to that, it's not like we get to a place where like, I'm healed, I'm there. I mean, maybe sometime in the eternities or whatever, as we're exalted but it's kind of like we upgrade, right? As you talk about in your other books, from 1.0 to 2.0. And it's not that, those 1.0 wounding and trauma or whatever it is, maybe a lot there gets healed, but then we're invited to maybe a larger story, a more dynamic, path that God wants us to go on, because it is developing us. And then there'll be some additional healing on that level that we'll need. Right. And so, there's never this, and I think sometimes we get that just in our culture of like, well, I've got my temple recommend, like I'm participating in church. I'm like, do my best to show up as a father, like whatever it is, and I'm good. And so that's where it's like, well, actually there's some healing on this level that you have to find, right? And so there's always maybe another level of healing, which is another level of becoming.
Yeah, I think I've heard it phrased this way: the absence of disease does not equal health. So we may not have disease in our life, right? We may not have drug issues, pornography issues. We may not, be sinning necessarily, right? We may be going to the temple every week. We may be reading our scriptures every day, saying our prayers, going to church every week. But that doesn't equal health, right? And I think I've shared this before is, like I look at my parents, and both of my parents have passed away, but I look at my parents and I felt like they checked all of the boxes in terms of the church. They were temple workers. They served 2 missions as kind of later in their life. They both served missions as young adults. They served in a variety of leadership callings. They checked a lot of the boxes on the doing side. But one of the things that I've come to kind of learn about my parents and how they raised me is that while my parents did the right things, they were not the most emotionally intelligent people, right? They struggled as parents to kind of meet the emotional needs of their children, to love and nurture them in the way that they needed to. So while they didn't have any disease, I wouldn't say that there was a lot of health there at the same time. And so I think so many times, or so often, we are mentioning in the church the behaviors. But I think what we've tried to bring out in our conversations is ultimately the gospel is about becoming, not just doing. And if we really want to become disciples of Jesus Christ, it requires us to look beyond the absence of disease and look more deeply at this notion of health.
Yeah, and that's really helpful framing of just because you're not suffering or out of control or in some of those stigma areas doesn't necessarily mean you're rocking it either, that you figured it out or cracked the code, right? So I don't know if I took you too far off our outline. We've talked about window of tolerance, personal complexity. We talked about a little bit about that, or is there more there?
So there's just different ways for us to investigate the quality of our being. Window of tolerance is one of those. Another thing that we can focus on is our personal complexity. So one of the things that I've come to learn is there's different types of complexity. And the more complex we are, that's an indicator of the quality and sophistication of our being. So if I ask you this question, Kurt, do you think Christ was a complex individual or a simple individual?
Extraordinarily complex.
Right? Extraordinarily complex.
Yeah.
He could sit with, right? He could proclaim we shouldn't do bad stuff on one hand and sit with sinners on the other hand. That feels really complex to me, right? Mm-hmm. It is not easy to get there. So there are different ways that we can categorize complexity. One of those ways is what we call emotional complexity. To what degree can we sit with complex emotions? Yeah. Such as, to what degree are we willing to be vulnerable? That signals how emotionally complex we are. To what degree are we willing to feel conflicting emotions? Like, Kurt, have you ever felt happy, sad?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, not everybody can feel that. Some people either default to one or the other, but they can't sit with both simultaneously.
Yeah.
Right. And that's an indication of our emotional complexity. There's also a concept of what's called self-complexity, which is to what degree do we see ourselves as a complex being? One of the ways that I like to articulate this is how many hats do we have in our closet, and what's our ability to take off and put on different hats? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I find with a lot of leaders that I work with is a lot of leaders always wear the results hat, and they have a hard time taking off that hat. And maybe they need to put on their culture hat, or maybe they need to put on their empathy hat, or maybe they need to put on their growth hat, right? And so there's some leaders that don't have a lot of hats in their closet and they only wear one hat. But there's other leaders who have a lot of hats in their closet and they have the ability to take off and put on different hats depending upon the needs of those circumstances. And so, and I see Christ as being this really self-complex person and leader. And so those are a couple of forms of complexity. There's also moral complexity. There's cognitive complexity. We don't have to dive into all of these, but this notion of complexity, because I think so often people in the church try to simplify, and there's nothing wrong with making something simple. But if we think simple-mindedly, we will oftentimes misstep in complex situations.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of maybe an individual listening, thinking, I don't know, Ryan, like I just show up on Sunday and do my best. Like, I don't know. It seems like I got one, maybe two hats in the closet. and maybe this is a natural result of doing our own work or seeking our own healing. Because as you do that, suddenly, hey, wait a minute, there's like 10 other hats in here. I never knew were there. And you get more, you become more, you're enabled, I guess I want to say, to actually reach for those hats and put them on. Is that a fair way to frame it?
Well, yeah. Well, I think when we could put terms on these things, like if we could go around to a bunch of church leaders and say, how emotionally complex are you? And in fact, we could do an assessment to try to figure that out. And what we're going to find is some are really emotionally complex and some are not emotionally complex. And if you're not emotionally complex, well, this is a place where we need healing.
Yeah.
And when we're not emotionally complex, it's not necessarily means that we're going to misstep in our leadership. But what it does probably mean is our impact is going to be limited.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't start to kind of do some of these introspective dives to explore the quality of our being, we may just simply settle for being the person that we are now. And we never leverage that as an opportunity to become the person and the leader that we can become.
Yeah. And I found just in my own journey of like, a part of that is the, dialing in the routines and habits, the religious habits of, attending church and finding deeper meaning there. But oftentimes while you're kind of there, and it shifts for different seasons where, maybe you're the bishop and you got the temple recommend, you're doing the things, you're a pretty good bishop or you're a pretty good Relief Society president, but then you kind of are invited on this journey with your career down another path. And then that creates some complexities in life and deeper opportunities for healing, right? It's not always necessarily clearly in this religious, lane of like, yeah, this is the next thing you're going to do. Or it could be like, we've been doing this bishopric thing for 2 years now, and I feel a sense of renewal that we need to maybe try something different, more dynamic, and see where that leads us.
Yeah, and I sense, and here's maybe another way for us, for bishop or ward leaders, to kind of consider the quality of their being is, to what degree are you focused on survival versus purpose?
Hmm.
And what I would find is that leaders who are more focused on just surviving, just getting through it, just making sure things run with as little problems as possible, that's one strategy for leadership. But it's not a very mature or sophisticated strategy for leadership. When we study the very best leaders, the best leaders are driven with a purpose. And that purpose is generally about creating value for the people that we serve, the stakeholders that are involved. And so, to what degree are we just simply, when we think about our ward council meetings, are we just focused on making sure that, all of the gears are turning? Or are we focused on something bigger than that? And that's a
Mm-hmm.
way to kind of gauge our being and how we're showing up
Yeah.
as a leader.
Yeah. That's my mind goes to Liz Wiseman's work with rookie smarts, right? Of the benefit you get when you're in that. Now I'm conflating with Whitney Johnson's work, the S curve, right, where you're like new and everything. You're trying to, you're more engaged. Where if you're just passively going through some of these experiences, maybe it's time to find a new challenge, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Let me just bring up another way for us to gauge the quality, kind of our being, if you will.
Okay.
And it's by investigating our relationships with different things. So we could ask ourselves, what is the quality of our relationship with risk?
Hmm.
That's probably going to be an indicator. If we really are focused on avoiding risk really strongly, that means that we probably have some really strong self-protective strategies. What is our relationship with failure or taking on a learning zone challenge? What I find is that 60% of leaders have a bad relationship with failure, meaning
Hmm.
they only want to do the things they know they will be successful at. Right? Because if
Sounds
I
like
fail
you're
as a leader, people are going to judge me, right? That's the pressure that we feel.
yeah. Sounds like you're dealing with a bunch of humans here. This is interesting.
Yeah, imagine that,
Yeah.
right? Right, I'm not perfect with any of these things, and
Yeah. Yeah.
knowing about this helps me to recognize places where I need some healing. Another thing to consider is, what is our relationship with conflict or
Hmm.
divergent ideas? Right? Do we react when we hear a divergent idea? Or do we actually like slow down and create space and investigate those divergent ideas? That's going to be an indication of kind of the quality of our being. what is our relationship with others? Right? Do we see others as objects, or do we see others as people? And then even more deeply, I think, is what is our relationship with ourselves?
That's
Um,
huge.
right? And do we have a good relationship with ourselves? Or are we somebody who beats ourselves up all the time? Right? In fact, I did a workshop earlier today, and one of the leaders that was a part of this workshop kind of admitted to the group, he says, I'm a people pleaser. And so we dove into that. Why? Why are you a people pleaser? Well, I feel like if I were to ever tell somebody no, that they wouldn't respect me. And I thought, interesting, right? So here's a person who has a hard time telling others no, drawing healthy boundaries because he's so afraid of offending other people. And that's just an indication that he's got some work to do on his being, some healing, right? He's got some fears and some insecurities that are holding him back. So a lot of times what I find in leaders is that are struggling is either they're kind of these people pleasers, or they're these hardliners who really rarely kind of connect with emotions. It's just, let's just get it done. Let's get the results. Let's do the things that we need to do. And those are two, I'm going to say, common leadership strategies that people have. And they ultimately come from a place of hurt, from fears, from a place of insecurity.
Yeah, I think that's, I really resonate with that a lot. And I think a lot of church leaders would resonate with that, where again, I don't have some stigmatized sin that I'm hiding, but oftentimes how that manifests is I want people to like me, right? And so I want to be a people pleaser, or which is the clinical term of codependency, where I'm just like, I'm trying to always manage the feelings around me. 15% of the ward doesn't like me. Like I can't sit with that. I got to go reach out to those 15%. But the deepest dark secret of leadership is, on average, about 15% of the ward always just kind of isn't a fan. And that's just the way it is, right? Yep. So oftentimes I'm asking myself, what is it about my journey, my past, where I can't sit with the fact that people don't like my style, or if they come to me and I tell them no, like, I can't sleep at night because that person's probably at home really mad at me or something, right? And so this is a great example I think a lot of church leaders can relate to. Like, yeah, you're fine and you're doing the things, but maybe you feel overwhelmed a lot because you're committing to more than you can actually do, right? And you're not setting good boundaries with yourself to actually function well and be more in health rather than just avoiding disease.
Yeah. So the leader that you just described is not necessarily a bad leader in terms of they're not like they may not be wrecking any havoc. But this leader you described also seems to be a leader whose body is overly preoccupied with ultimately themselves, and not on the people that they're leading. And that's ultimately one of the inherent challenges that we have, is a lot of times when we have fears and insecurities, it makes us more focused on ourselves than on the people we are leading and serving. And therefore, if we could better heal ourselves, or to the degree that we heal ourselves, our eyes will shift away from ourselves and towards the people that we serve. And again, coming back to kind of Christ as our exemplar, where was his eyes? We just sense it was never on himself. It was always on the person, the people in front of him, or his broader mission and purpose.
Yeah. Or I'd even add that when he got to those places of, in his human form, got to those places of overwhelm, he turned his eyes towards the Father. I think it's 7 times in the text where he separated himself from everybody to go and commune with God, because that was his source of strength to then, get back in that mindset to return and continue to level up.
Yeah. And I mean, even that, I think there's a lesson in there. And I've seen this with business leaders that I work with, is you cannot draw from an empty tank.
Yeah.
As leaders, we need to take time for ourselves to recharge ourselves, right? Because the more depleted we feel, the more we're going to be at the edges of our window of tolerance. Yeah. And so there is something about taking some time to for ourselves, drawing those healthy boundaries so that we can fill our tank and present ourselves to the people that we serve in the healthiest way possible.
Yep. Love it. Anything else with, we've talked about relationship with, just understanding relationship with time, failure, mistakes. Like, and this is kind of a good exercise to maybe start to uncover this personal wounding or the places of healing that you need. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I think I think everything, if I was to summarize everything that we talked about, is this notion of, I think a lot of times we think about how do we go from bad to good? And that's kind of like this, how do we avoid the absence of disease, or how do we get to the absence of disease? But really everything that we've been talking about is not going from bad to good. It's going from good to great. And I hope one of the takeaways that listeners get is it requires this process of going from good to great. It requires a different approach and a different way of thinking than what we're historically used to. And so, yeah, I hope that that's a valuable takeaway.
Awesome. Where do you want to go next?
I hope what this inspires leaders to do is to think more about how they can heal themselves so they could show up more as the person and the leader that they want to be. And just one of the things that I found really difficult about this for people is, honestly, this is really difficult for us to do on our own. We generally need some sort of mentor, coach, guide to help facilitate us through this process. And so I know that, Kurt, you've been a big proponent of kind of these retreats that you've gone on. And I just kind of imagine that's retreats or something like that are ways for us to do this type of work. I mean, we got to select the right retreats and we're focused on the right things.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you want to take some time to just comment on how those experiences have impacted your being, your nervous system, and who you are, and how you've seen them play a role and how you've transformed.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to a word you just used, is experiences. Like, if someone's asked me with my time with leading saints, that, we've been doing the podcast over 10 years now, and 850 or so episodes, and if someone asked me, like, all right, like, Kurt, boil it down, like, what's the secret to leadership, right? And one of the big ones I keep coming back to is there's power in experiences, right? It's not about reading the book. It's not about like going to church and hearing that, sacrament meeting talk and like digesting that information or, whatever it is. But if you can go have an experience somewhere where God has a window of opportunity to really transform your being, that's the sweet spot of transformation. Because that is what we are trying to do with leadership, is to create a transformation experience. And so retreats have been a really effective way of creating a container for transformation. And this is why, we've been doing it for years. We can all think back to the Boy Scout camp, the girls camp, right? The EFY, like these were containers to offer an experience. It wasn't just the day-to-day things, though, the quick moments of communion with God and prayer and scripture study are key components, but there's something about disconnecting from the world and trying to step into another realm. And so, and it's so, I always laugh, like, people, as I, facilitate these, they're often men's retreats. And we have some other retreats for women as well. But if I was to show, they always ask, what's the agenda, right? Like, what are we going to talk about? And now if I showed you the agenda, you'd be like, I don't get it. Like, it doesn't seem like anything special. But there's something about disconnecting and stepping into an experience that lets God like step into it with you, right? And this is, again, our tradition of the temple is very much like this. We want to disconnect and step into a different realm so that we can experience something, not necessarily learn something, right?
Yep.
And so that's what my mind goes to with these retreat experiences. I don't know, even as an Elders Quorum president, I'm processing like something in the fall, and not that we have like a deep budget by any means, but how can I create an experience for the elders? It's not necessarily, who's the best teacher I can find on Sunday to teach the general conference lesson. Again, we do that stuff, but it's more of like, okay, how can I stimulate an experience? And it doesn't have to be anything dynamic with all sorts of bells and whistles and meals and, all these, the speaker lineup or anything like that. But I just know the power of experiences invites, kind of separates the doing from the becoming. And
Yeah.
and on paper, it's like, that doesn't make sense, Kurt. That shouldn't work. But in practice, it's remarkable.
Yeah, and one of the things for these, I'm there with you. And in order for these experiences to have this kind of transformational impact that we've been talking about, is ultimately they have to adjust and alter our body's nervous system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and experiences are really important part of that process. And so that's almost why experiences are so valuable, because if we just show up to a class, it's really hard to alter our body's nervous system. But we can do that through experiences.
Yeah.
Let me share a couple of examples on my end. So I run kind of a retreat thing every year with a partner. His name's Chris Spear. He's an LDS guy, and the program isn't necessarily for LDS people. It's really
Yeah.
for business leaders. But many of the people who have signed up for this program have been LDS. And there was one particular gentleman who signed up for this program because he wanted to be a better leader in his professional practice. And we asked him, after he went through this kind of retreat and some of these experiences that we provided, what did you gain from this? And what his answer kind of floored me is he talks about how his relationship with his wife had changed. And it was transformational. I said, tell me more. And he said, well, my wife is somebody who's struggled with health problems. And her health problems have limited her ability to show me love and affection. And I have felt alone in that. And I imagine, it's just heartbreaking to hear that. But he said, through this experience, I now approach my wife differently. I have now changed my relationship with her. And now I have a greater capacity to connect with and be with her than I had previously.
Hmm.
And this capacity to connect, go from kind of being a little bit more reactive in this relationship to create space in this relationship, that's an indication there's been a change in his nervous system.
Hmm.
And I imagine I imagine he would say, I feel like I'm a more Christ-like person, would be one of the ways that he would describe himself. So that's one example. And I think for me,
Yeah.
it doesn't always have to be a retreat. Like, I worked with a trauma therapist for over 2 years to help me heal from my past traumas. And
Uh-huh.
I feel like that experience has done more to help me to become more like Christ than serving a mission for 2 years, for example.
Yeah. 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 That's so true. And it is tricky because these retreat experiences can be so expensive, right? And we've done some things to create scholarships and things for people to get there. But again, it doesn't have to be, just outrageously dynamic and there's so many. Even as I think about elders quorum, I'm often going to a place of, how can I offer the elders an experience rather than a lesson,
Yes.
right? And inviting God to step into that pool of revelation to say, how can I do that, right? And again, we've I've talked about them on Leading Saints, where we've been able to do that in the simplest ways. So
Well, I think I've seen some of your content come across, some of the things that you do with your elders quorum, and I'll just maybe make it explicit like this. I don't think God comes into lessons where we're talking about facts or history or things like that.
yeah,
I think where God comes into lessons is when people are vulnerable.
yeah,
And so one of the things that I've appreciated, just what I've read from what some of the practices you've engaged in with your elders quorum, is to, at the end of the meeting, circle around and allow people to share what they're going through, and if the elders quorum can pray for them,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
that's a type of place where I think God shows up.
yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because even this last Sunday, as we did that, I think a lot of the quorum was helping in primary. It was Mother's Day, so we kind of had a smaller group, but um, there's something about, like, I always take about the last, when there's about 8 to 10 minutes left in quorum, I gather everybody around. We've been having just different discussion groups, and I invite them to consider ways that we can pray for them. And then I'm quiet. Now, what I'm doing there is as I sit there, and even this past Sunday was like 15 to 20 seconds of like dead silence of me standing there saying, kind of just when you're ready, because what I'm doing there is I'm offering them an experience to step into. I'm saying, will you take the step of vulnerability? And we're here to catch you when you do that. Right. And sometimes I have to wait a little longer, but men start to step in. Or I have a connection during the week with an elder in my quorum, and he, opens up with me on a one-on-one basis. And I always make the invitation, hey, when we pray on Sunday as a quorum, will you bring this up? Because when you do that, you show people it's safe to step into that experience, then others begin to do that. And again, the end result is this undeniable unity, connection, and bonding that we have as a quorum. And that's the machine or the engine of it that just keeps creating that experience. And the elders 11. I mean, I ask for feedback a lot, saying, "All right, now really, like, what can we do? What are you liking? What are you not liking?" They're saying this is the best elders quorum experience I've ever had, because again, I'm striving to offer them an experience, rather than just a lesson. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the potential of our church experience. Is the potential of our church experience is to provide healing experiences. I just don't think it happens very much, not because people don't want it, but because most people don't know how to do it. They don't have these ideas like you've come up with, right? So what we default is what we've been taught or what we've experienced, which is largely coming from our educational experiences, like in schools or in workshops or in things like that, which really aren't experiences. But like, I just kind of feel like most Sunday school or elders quorum lessons that I go to, it feels more like the teacher has all of the information that they want to download into a flash drive, and they're just trying to plug it into us and download that information. And that's not an experience. But I think that there is an opportunity for us to create healing experiences for sure. And so I love that idea.
Yeah. And there's just natural resistance and because of these traditions and things, even to the nature of the rooms in which we meet, right? I actually met with this is a former general Sunday school presidency, and I brought this up. They kind of looked at me like I had three heads, which a lot of people do as I talk about these things. But I say that, if we want to transform teaching, we even have to consider how these rooms are laid out. I mean, oftentimes Sunday school is done in the release society room, maybe, right? And we kind of cram in there, and there's a lot of people, and the easiest way to fit people are these rows. But now we're dictating how that experience is going to go because of the nature of the room. And so how can you push past that, right? How can you have more rooms? And that's why I love having elders quorum in the culture hall, is because I have so much space to work with, right? And it's not acoustics aren't ideal and all that, but I also know there's actually a lot I can do with this room to create an experience.
For sure. So, I couldn't agree more. Is the setting and the setup of that setting plays a huge role in the types of experiences we could create.
Yeah. And I want to highlight even sacrament itself. I mean, our religious experience is quite unique, that we prioritize the sacrament or communion experience, where you go to other evangelical churches, and they may, everyone every few weeks, let's get out the juice and crackers and do the thing, and which they do just fine, but that is an experience. It's an experiential thing, right? Someone just doesn't stand and talk about the importance of the Last Supper and what Christ was teaching there. They bring physical bread and water to you, so you taste it, you touch it, you feel it, right? And so anyways, that's, I think, a great experience that I love in our faith tradition, that we take that time and prioritize that time of an experience.
Yeah, love it.
We covered all, Ryan. These are always fun conversations.
Yeah, I hope we've just, I think in a way what we've done is we've created we've opened the door for leaders to consider a strategy for personal and spiritual development that they may not have considered before. And it's really we've got to open that door for people to even step into it. So I hope that this has helped open the door for anybody listening, and that you take some efforts to step into it. And if it's, I guess maybe I'll give a shameless plug for my new book coming out,
Yes,
Becoming
please.
Better, that I do think it can be a helpful resource to any person, any leader that wants to become better. I mean, that's the whole purpose why I wrote the book, and we cover a lot of these ideas that we've talked about, but it's ultimately there to help you kind of gauge the quality of your being and how you can elevate your being. So I hope it's okay if I make a plug there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll link to that and make sure people find that easily. And maybe let's tease a little bit more like this opportunity if people want to step into this place of, I don't know if it's a place of vulnerability, but, to maybe we'll record a conversation between you and a leader listening out there. And I don't know, how would you tease that or encourage that or
Yeah.
promote that?
So the exercise is just an incredibly powerful exercise, and it's a deep introspective dive that's meant to uncover two things: a mental block, at least one mental block, and a self protective mindset driving that mental block. And
Mhm.
it is just this deep introspective dive. When we can uncover those things, then we could develop a strategy to rise above those things, to become more of the person that we want to become. Yeah, so it's an exercise. It generally, if we do it, there's kind of, you could do it an abbreviated version, which usually takes about 45 minutes to an hour, but we could also extend it to over 90 minutes. And of course, we wouldn't want to do that. We'd just do an abbreviated version, but it would be just taking somebody who's passionate about becoming better, willing to be at least a little bit vulnerable, to do some self exploration, to in a way to uncover some deep introspective insights about themselves and how they can become more of the person that they want to become. So, honestly, I walk people through this program, and I'll charge them a decent amount of money to kind of go through a coaching
Yeah, I
program. Of
bet.
course, we won't take them through the entire coaching program, but we'll give a taste of it for anybody who might be interested.
Yeah.
And I think just it'll just open up for any listeners. So I think about it this way: is I think you'll open up the door for helping other listeners to do some transformative personal work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of the leaders listening out there who maybe that leader's is like, I just feel stuck, or, I'm on year 4 or 5 as bishop, or I've been doing this Relief Society thing for 3 years and, I feel stuck or frustrated, or the same problems keep coming up. Like these are maybe some opportunities to say, hey, why don't I lean into this
Yeah.
and trust in the process and see what comes out of it. And at the same time, help other leaders um, have an experience as well. So
But yeah. So, in the most ideal person for this has got to be somebody who has a passion about becoming better in some way. They've got to have an
perfect.
aspiration, right? It's got to be, I want to become a better what, or I want to become more what. And it needs to be something that's meaningful to them, and something where they know that there's some room for improvement in this area.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, I walked some leaders through this earlier today. One leader said, I want to become a better listener. Another leader said, I wanted to become a more strategic leader or a more empowering leader. So those are some examples, because that aspiration is the starting point for the exercise. So if you're somebody and you've got this aspiration, but you haven't been able to make as much progress towards it as you want to, that's what this exercise is designed to help you with.
Love it. Awesome. Well, we'll link to your book, Becoming Better, right? Is there a subtitle?
Yeah, the groundbreaking science of personal transformation.
Well, there it is. Sounds like a good podcast title as well. Maybe we'll see. But and so we'll link to that, and hopefully people check it out. Just the last, what's the last encouragement do you have, just to frame all this and be in a concise way? What's the final encouragement you'd leave for the listening audience?
Well, I think, and maybe this is repetitious from some of our previous conversations, but I've come to just learn that the more, the path to becoming more like Christ is through healing ourselves, through healing our minds, our bodies, and our hearts. And I think that's ultimately the way that we use the atonement. That's the purpose of the atonement is healing. And I think what we've suggested is if you aren't actively seeking healing, you're not using the atonement, maybe is one of the ways to think about it.